He sank his entire shelter 4 feet into the ground. Aqsaqtuaq, who had survived 50 Arctic winters and buried 4 children to the cold, told him plainly, "The fire will eat your wood. Then the box becomes a coffin." He had $47, 300 miles of frozen emptiness, and needed fuel the coast could not supply. On January 10th, 1907, the wind chill plunged past 90 below. But 7 months earlier, Ernest de Koven Leffingwell had never spent a single night on Arctic tundra in his life. In the summer of 1906, the schooner, Duchess of Bedford, pushed through the ice floes north of Point Barrow, carrying a 31-year-old geologist who had never felt cold that could kill. Ernest de Koven Leffingwell stood at the rail with his theodolite case strapped across his chest, watching the gray water churn against the hull. He had rowed crew at the University of Chicago. He had fought in Cuba during the Spanish War. He had published papers on glacial formations and won grants from the Royal Geographic Society. None of it mattered here. The ship's captain, a Norwegian named Mikkelsen, who had survived 3 Arctic winters, found Leffingwell studying his charts in the cramped cabin below deck. The young geologist had spread his maps across the table, marking survey points along the coastline east of Flaxman Island, 300 miles of unmapped territory, coastline that existed on no American chart, mountains that had never been measured. Mikkelsen looked at the marks and said nothing for a long moment. "You understand what winter means here," he said finally. It was not a question. Leffingwell looked up from his charts. "I've read the expedition accounts. Peary, Greeley. I know the temperatures." "You know the numbers?" Mikkelsen pulled a chair and sat across from him. "The numbers mean nothing until you feel them. At 50 below, your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. The moisture in your lungs turns to ice. Metal burns skin like fire. A man caught in the open at 60 below is dead in 2 hours, maybe less. I'll have shelter. The cabin we're building on Flaxman. Your cabin is one place. You want to survey 300 miles. How many nights between shelter?" Mikkelsen leaned forward. "A blizzard comes fast here. No warning. You could be 15 miles from your cabin when the temperature drops 40 degrees in 4 hours. I have seen men freeze standing up. They did not have time to sit down." Leffingwell set down his pencil. "What would you have me do? Abandon the survey? I would have you understand that your university training means nothing here. The Inupiat have survived this coast for 4,000 years. They know things your professors never imagined. If you want to live through this winter, you will learn from them, not from your books." The young geologist smiled. "I intend to hire local assistants. I'll pay fair wages." "Pay," Mikkelsen repeated. He did not smile back. "The Inupiat don't need your money. They need nothing from you, but they may teach you anyway if they decide you are worth saving." He stood and moved toward the ladder. "Most white men who come here are not." The Duchess of Bedford dropped anchor off Flaxman Island on the 14th of August, 1906. The crew had 12 weeks, maybe 14, to build a cabin, stock supplies, and prepare for a winter that would last 8 months. The sun would disappear entirely by late November and not return until late January. Leffingwell threw himself into the work. He had $47 in personal funds. The expedition budget provided lumber, tools, nails, and provisions for 2 years. What it did not provide was experience. The cabin went up quickly. 16 feet by 20 feet, walls of salvaged ship timber, a cast iron stove in the center. Leffingwell calculated the fuel requirements with the precision of a man who trusted mathematics. At an average interior temperature of 40 degrees, burning wood continuously, he would need approximately 3 cords per month. 24 cords for an 8-month winter. He had 12. The driftwood along the coast was scattered and sparse. Each piece had to be dragged across the tundra by hand or dog sled. The physical labor was brutal. Leffingwell's rowing muscles burned and cramped in the unfamiliar cold. His hands blistered inside his wool gloves. His shoulders ached from hauling timber across frozen ground. By mid-September, the ice was forming along the shore. By early October, the Duchess of Bedford was trapped. That was when Leffingwell met the Inupiat families who lived in the sod houses 3 miles east of his cabin. The first time Leffingwell visited the village, he brought tobacco and sugar, trade goods the expedition had packed for exactly this purpose. He found 7 families living in structures that looked at first glance like mounds of earth, low hills covered in brown grass, indistinguishable from the tundra itself. An elder named Aqsaqtuaq watched the white man approach. He was perhaps 60 years old, though his weathered face made age impossible to guess. He had survived more than 50 Arctic winters. He had buried 2 wives and 4 children. He had seen white men come before, whalers mostly, and a few government men who asked questions and wrote in books and then left. This one carried a theodolite. "You are building a box," Aqsaqtuaq said in English, rough, learned from traders at Point Barrow. "A wooden box with a fire inside." Leffingwell nodded. "A cabin. It's nearly finished. The fire will eat your wood. Then what?" "I'll gather more driftwood. There's enough along the coast to last." "There is not." Aqsaqtuaq did not raise his voice. "I have lived here since before your father was born. There is not enough wood on this coast to feed a fire for 8 months, not for one man burning continuously. You will run out before the sun returns. Then the box will become a coffin." The words landed like stones. Leffingwell looked at the sod house behind the elder. Smoke rose from a small hole in the center of the mound, but no woodpile sat nearby. No stockpile of fuel. Yet the family inside was clearly warm. He could hear children laughing through the walls. "How do you heat your homes?" he asked. Aqsaqtuaq smiled for the first time. "We do not fight the cold. We let the earth hold it for us. Come, I will show you." The entrance to the sod house was not where Leffingwell expected. Instead of a door in the wall, there was a depression in the ground several feet from the structure. Aqsaqtuaq descended into it, 4 steps down a sloping tunnel that dropped below the level of the tundra. Leffingwell followed. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. It ran approximately 15 feet, descending further before turning sharply to the left. At the lowest point, the temperature was brutal, as cold as the outside air, maybe colder. Leffingwell felt the bite through his wool coat. Then the tunnel rose, 3 steps up through a trapdoor in the floor, and suddenly, impossibly, warmth. The chamber was perhaps 11 feet across, circular, with walls of whalebone and driftwood frames covered in caribou hides. The ceiling was low. Leffingwell could not stand fully upright, but the space felt open, alive. A raised platform at the far end held sleeping furs, and in the center of the room, a shallow stone dish held a small flame. One flame, no bigger than Leffingwell's fist. "The lamp burns seal oil," Aqsaqtuaq said. "1 lamp, maybe 2, the rest is the earth." Leffingwell stared. Outside, the temperature was 12 degrees below zero. Inside this room, heated by nothing more than a flame smaller than a candle and the bodies of a family of 5, the air felt almost comfortable. 40 degrees, perhaps, maybe warmer. "I don't understand," he said. "The heat should rise and escape through the roof. The cold should pour in through the tunnel. The tunnel is the secret." Aqsaqtuaq pointed down through the trap door. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. The tunnel goes down below the floor, so the cold falls into it and stays there. The warm air here is light. It rises. But there is nowhere for it to go. The cold below acts like a wall made of air. Leffingwell's mind raced. He had studied thermodynamics, density stratification. The principle was simple, elegant, and completely invisible in any Western building design he had ever seen. "How deep does the tunnel drop?" he asked. 4 feet below the floor, sometimes 5. The deeper, the better. The cold pools at the bottom like water in a bowl. As long as the floor is higher than the lowest point of the tunnel, the warm air cannot escape down. A cold trap. The Inupiat had engineered a cold trap using nothing but geometry and the physical properties of air, principles that Western scientists had only formalized in equations within the past century, and they had been using it for 4,000 years. "How long to build one?" Leffingwell asked. Aqsaqtuaq studied him for a moment. "For a man who knows how? One day? For a man who has never tried?" He shrugged. "You would die before you finished. The weather would take you." "Then teach me." The elder was quiet for a long time. The flame in the oil lamp flickered. The children behind him had stopped playing. They watched the white man with curious eyes. "Teaching takes time," Aqsaqtuaq said finally. "The winter is coming. You should stay in your box and burn your wood and pray it lasts until the ship comes back. That is the safe path for a man like you." "I didn't come here to be safe." "No," the elder agreed. "You came here to measure the land, to make marks on paper." His eyes were sharp, unreadable. "The land does not care about your measurements. The cold does not care how many books you have read. I have seen men like you before. They are always certain, and they are often dead." Leffingwell held his gaze. "Then let me earn the knowledge. I'll work. I'll pay. Whatever you ask." Aqsaqtuaq turned away and spoke quietly to his wife in their language. A rapid exchange, too fast for Leffingwell to catch. Then the elder faced him again. "You will come here every day for 1 month. You will watch. You will dig. You will learn to cut snow blocks and measure tunnel depth and understand how the earth breathes. And in return, you will give us nothing." "Nothing?" "Payment would make this a trade. A trade ends when the goods are exchanged. What I give you is a gift. A gift obligates you forever." Aqsaqtuaq's eyes held something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "When you use this knowledge to survive, you will owe the Inupiat people for the rest of your life. That is the price." The month that followed nearly broke him. Leffingwell's days split in half. Mornings at the Inupiat village, digging practice trenches into the permafrost, learning to cut snow blocks with the curved knife Aqsaqtuaq called a pana, memorizing the angles of tunnel construction that seemed arbitrary until they suddenly made physical sense. Afternoons at his own cabin, maintaining the fire, gathering what driftwood he could, watching his fuel supply dwindle. The first practice shelter took him 3 days to build. Aqsaqtuaq pronounced it a death trap. "The tunnel is too shallow. The floor is not level. If you slept here, you would wake with frost on your face, if you woke at all." Leffingwell filled it in and started again. The second attempt was better. The tunnel descended properly, the floor was elevated, and the dimensions were close to correct. But the roof collapsed under its own weight before he could finish sealing it. "Snow blocks must be cut at an angle," Aqsaqtuaq said, demonstrating. "Like this. Each one leans against the next. The weight pushes in, not down. A dome, not a box." Leffingwell nodded, his hands raw inside his mittens. His fingers had cracked from the cold, and the wounds refused to heal in the dry Arctic air. He had lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks. His appetite had vanished, replaced by a constant gnawing exhaustion that sleep did not touch. The third shelter held. Aqsaqtuaq inspected it without expression. He crawled through the tunnel, ran his hands along the walls, checked the ventilation hole at the apex. Then he sat in the center of the small chamber and waited. 2 hours later, he emerged. The temperature inside reached 31 degrees above zero, he said. Outside it was 18 below. That is 49 degrees of difference, with no fire, no lamp, only the heat of one old man's body. He looked at Leffingwell with something that might have been approval. You learn faster than most. Is it enough? Will it keep a man alive in the worst conditions? In the worst conditions? Aqsaqtuaq shook his head slowly. The worst conditions, there is no shelter that saves you. But this, he gestured at the snow mound that concealed the chamber below. This will keep you alive in conditions that would kill any man in a wooden box. At 50 below, maybe 60 below, you will survive inside this shelter with nothing but your own warmth. That is what 4,000 years of knowledge gives you. The other surveyors thought he had lost his mind. A team from the Revenue Cutter Service stopped at Flaxman Island in late October before the ice closed in completely. Lieutenant James Caldwell commanded the patrol, a career naval officer who had spent 6 years in Alaska and considered himself an expert on the territory. He found Leffingwell behind his cabin, practicing snow block construction in a trench he had dug into a drift. "What in God's name are you doing?" Leffingwell looked up. His face was weathered now, the soft features of his university days roughened by cold and wind. His beard had grown in patchy and ice-crusted. He looked, Caldwell thought, like a man going native. "Building a shelter." "You have a cabin, a perfectly good cabin with a stove." "The cabin is one location. I need to survey 300 miles of coastline. I can't drag a cabin with me." Caldwell stared at the half-finished snow structure. "So you're digging a hole in the ground, like the natives." "It's called a cold trap. The physics are sound. A tunnel descending below floor level creates a density barrier that I know what the natives do." Caldwell's voice carried the particular contempt of a man who had watched other expeditions fail. "I also know that a commissioned survey officer has no business abandoning Western methods for primitive alternatives. The Navy's position on these matters is clear. Proper equipment, proper training, proper shelter, not holes in the dirt." Leffingwell set down his knife. "Lieutenant, the Greeley expedition followed proper Navy doctrine. 19 of 25 men died." "That was a supply failure, not a shelter failure." "The Jeannette expedition followed proper Navy doctrine. 20 of 33 men died. The Franklin expedition followed proper Royal Navy doctrine. All 129 men died." Leffingwell's voice remained calm, but his eyes were hard. "Do you see a pattern, Lieutenant? The men who die are the ones who refuse to learn from the people who have lived here for millennia. The ones who survive, Amundsen, Stephenson, Ray, are the ones who adopt indigenous methods." Caldwell's face reddened. "Ray was a disgrace. The Navy. The Navy laughed at Ray when he recommended snowshoes. Then Navy men died in the snow while Ray walked home." Leffingwell picked up his knife and turned back to his work. "You can file whatever report you like, Lieutenant. I intend to complete my survey and return alive. If that requires ignoring Navy doctrine, so be it." Caldwell was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter and colder. "The survey appropriation requires government oversight. Your reports must be filed through proper channels. If your methods are found to be irregular, the funding could be withdrawn. Your maps could be rejected." He paused. You might complete your survey and find that no one accepts the results. Leffingwell did not look up. Then I'll have 300 miles of coastline mapped for my own satisfaction. Either way, I'll be alive to appreciate it. The lieutenant turned and walked back toward the shore where his cutter waited in the ice-choked harbor. He did not say goodbye. November brought the darkness. By the 20th, the sun no longer rose above the horizon. A gray twilight persisted for a few hours around midday, enough light to see, barely enough to work, and then the world returned to black. The temperature dropped steadily, 20 below, 30 below. The ice along the coast groaned and cracked with sounds like gunshots. Leffingwell's fuel supply fell faster than his calculations had predicted. The problem was moisture. The driftwood he had gathered was saturated with seawater, frozen into the grain. When he burned it, the water had to boil off before the wood would catch, and that process consumed heat rather than producing it. Each cord of wet wood generated perhaps half the warmth of a dry cord. By December 1st, he had 4 cords remaining. At his current burn rate, he would run out by mid-January. The ship would not return until July. 6 months of winter. 4 cords of wood. The math was simple and brutal. He stopped heating the cabin continuously. He burned wood only in the evening, enough to raise the temperature above freezing for a few hours, then let the fire die overnight. He slept in his furs, fully clothed, his breath forming ice crystals on the ceiling above his face. The cold seeped into everything. His chronometer stopped working. The lubricant in its gears had frozen solid. His theodolite's brass fittings contracted in the cold, throwing off his measurements. He wrapped the metal components in tape to keep his skin from freezing to them. And still, the temperature dropped. December 6th, 42 below zero at dawn. December 9th, 47 below. December 12th, 51 below, and falling. On the morning of December 14th, Leffingwell woke to find his water barrel frozen solid to the bottom. He had kept it inside the cabin, 3 feet from the stove. The fire had been dead for 8 hours, but even so, the temperature inside his shelter must have dropped below zero. Outside, his thermometer read -54. He built a fire and crouched beside it, waiting for his hands to warm enough to grip tools. The wood burned poorly, more smoke than heat, but slowly the cabin's interior climbed back toward 20 degrees. 21, 22. It took an hour to reach 30. He was measuring his remaining fuel when he heard the dogs. The Inupiat traveled by sled, and the sound carried far across the frozen tundra, the yipping of the team, the hiss of runners on packed snow. Leffingwell pulled on his parka and stepped outside. The sled came from the east, from the direction of Aqsaqtuaq's village, but the figure driving it was not the elder. It was his son-in-law, a younger man named Aqsaqtuaq, who traded fox pelts at Point Barrow. The sled carried caribou meat, 200 pounds, maybe more, frozen solid in the cold. "My father-in-law sends this," Aqsaqtuaq said. "He says the white man's wood is running out." Leffingwell stared at the meat. He had not asked for help. He had not admitted to anyone how desperate his situation had become. How did he know? "Smoke," Aqsaqtuaq gestured at the cabin's chimney. "Thin smoke, not thick. Wet wood, not enough of it. Everyone in the village knows." He began unloading the meat, stacking it against the cabin wall where it would stay frozen. "You have been burning your shelter. Now you will eat instead." The meat would not heat his cabin, but it would keep him alive, and if he stopped burning wood for heat, what remained might last through the winter, if he had somewhere warm to sleep. "Tell Aqsaqtuaq I will repay this," Leffingwell said. "You cannot." Aqsaqtuaq smiled. "It was a gift. You owe it forever." That night, Leffingwell made his decision. He could not continue heating the cabin. The fuel would not last, and even if it did, the cabin's design was fighting him, heat rising to the ceiling, cold seeping in through every crack, the structure's volume too large to warm efficiently with the little wood he had left. But 3 miles east, a man was sleeping in a hole in the ground, heated by nothing but an oil lamp and his own body. And 50 yards behind Leffingwell's cabin, he had spent a month learning to build exactly that kind of shelter. Tomorrow he would start digging. The shovel was frozen to the ground outside his door. He freed it with the flat of an axe, then carried it inside to warm the metal. His hands were already cracked and bleeding from weeks of cold weather work. This would make them worse. He thought of Aqsaqtuaq's words. A gift obligates you forever. The knowledge the elder had given him was about to face its test. He began at first light, such as it was. The gray twilight that passed for noon at this latitude gave him perhaps 4 hours of visibility. After that, he would work by lantern, or not at all. The site he chose was 50 yards behind his cabin, where a snowdrift had accumulated against a low ridge. The drift was deep enough to excavate without hitting frozen ground. Important, because digging through permafrost with hand tools was nearly impossible. Snow could be cut and shaped. Permafrost could only be chipped away in agonizing fragments. Leffingwell marked out the dimensions with stakes and cord. The living chamber would be 4 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and 6.5 feet long, just large enough for a man to lie down and sit up. Any larger would be harder to heat with body warmth alone. The entrance tunnel would run 6 feet from the chamber, angling down an additional 18 inches below the floor level. That depth was critical. Aqsaqtuaq had been clear. The cold trap only worked if the tunnel's lowest point was below the chamber floor. The deeper the drop, the more effective the barrier. He started digging. The first hour was the worst. His muscles, weakened by weeks of reduced rations and poor sleep, screamed in protest. The shovel blade bit into the packed snow, each stroke sending shocks up through his arms and into his shoulders. His breath came in ragged gasps that froze into crystals before his face. By the second hour, he had cleared the top 2 feet of the chamber. By the third hour, his hands had stopped hurting. That was not a good sign. He pulled off his mittens and examined his fingers. The tips were white and waxy, the first stage of frostbite. He tucked them into his armpits and waited, stamping his feet to keep blood moving, until the burning sensation of returning circulation told him the damage was not permanent. Then he picked up the shovel and continued. The tunnel was the hardest part. Digging downward from the chamber floor, Leffingwell had to excavate in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders. The snow he removed had to be passed up and out in small loads, bucket by bucket. Every 10 minutes he had to back out of the tunnel and stand upright to catch his breath. The work took 3 days. On the first day, he completed the chamber and the first 3 feet of tunnel. The temperature dropped to 56 below overnight, and he slept in his cabin with no fire, huddled in every fur he owned, waking every few hours to flex his fingers and toes. On the second day, he finished the tunnel's descent and began the angled section that would bring it to the surface. A section of the roof collapsed, burying his tools. He dug them out with his bare hands, lost 2 hours, and continued. On the third day, he cut the snow blocks for the roof. Aqsaqtuaq had taught him the technique. Cut each block at an angle so the edges locked together, then pack loose snow into the seams to seal them. The blocks had to be uniform in size, approximately 18 inches by 12 inches by 8 inches, or the weight distribution would be wrong. Too much weight on one side and the whole structure would collapse inward. His first attempt at the roof failed. The blocks were too thick, too heavy. They pressed down on the walls and cracked the support structure. He cleared the debris, recut the blocks to a thinner dimension, and tried again. This time, the roof held. He sealed the seams with packed snow, carved a ventilation hole at the apex the size of his fist, and crawled back out through the tunnel to inspect his work from the outside. From above, the shelter was invisible, a slight mound in the snow, indistinguishable from the dozens of other drifts that covered the tundra. The entrance was a dark depression that looked like nothing more than a shadow. Inside, complete darkness. He tested the shelter that night. The thermometer outside read 58 below zero, the coldest temperature Leffingwell had ever experienced. The air hurt to breathe. Moisture from his lungs froze on his beard within seconds of each exhale. He crawled into the tunnel. The cold intensified as he descended. At the lowest point, 18 inches below the chamber floor, the temperature was brutal, at least as cold as the outside air, maybe colder. The density stratification was working. Cold air, heavy and dense, was pooling in the tunnel's depression exactly as Aqsaqtuaq had described. He climbed up into the chamber. The difference was immediate. Not warm, not yet, but noticeably less cold. The air felt still, insulated, protected from the wind that howled across the tundra above. He pulled his sleeping furs into the chamber and arranged them on the raised platform at the far end, the highest point in the structure where the warmest air would collect. Then he blocked the tunnel entrance with his pack, leaving a gap for ventilation, and waited. 1 hour. The temperature inside the chamber climbed to 11 below zero, 58 below outside, 11 below inside. 47 degrees of difference, and he had done nothing but sit there. 2 hours. The temperature reached 4 below. His body heat was accumulating in the small sealed space, unable to escape past the cold air barrier in the tunnel below. 3 hours. 2 above zero. Leffingwell pulled out his journal and wrote by candlelight, the small flame adding its own heat to the chamber. December 17th, 1906. Exterior temperature, minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature after 3 hours, plus 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Differential, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. No fuel consumed. Body heat only. The principle is sound. The shelter works. He blew out the candle and slept. When he woke, the temperature inside had climbed to 9 degrees above zero. Outside, according to the thermometer he had left on a stake, it had dropped to 61 below. 70 degrees of difference, no fire, no lamp, nothing but the insulating properties of packed snow and the elegant physics of the cold trap. He had survived the night. The news traveled. Aqsaqtuaq appeared 2 days later, driving his sled from the village with a load of seal oil. He inspected the shelter without entering it, studying the entrance depression, the slight mound of the roof, the ventilation hole from which a thin plume of vapor rose. "My father-in-law wishes to see this," he said. Leffingwell blinked. "He taught me how to build it." "He taught you the knowledge. He did not see you use it." Aqsaqtuaq's expression was unreadable. "There is a difference." 2 days later, Aqsaqtuaq arrived. The elder moved slowly now. The cold made his joints ache, he explained, and the dark months were hard on old bones. But his eyes were sharp as he descended into the tunnel, crawled through to the chamber, and sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "The tunnel angle is wrong. It should turn more sharply. The wind will find its way inside eventually." Leffingwell nodded, making notes. "The ventilation hole is too large. You will lose heat. Make it smaller, the size of 2 fingers, not a fist." More notes. "The sleeping platform is good. The dimensions are correct." Aqsaqtuaq paused. "For a first real shelter, it is acceptable. You will not die in this." "Acceptable?" "I have seen worse. I have also seen better." The elder's eyes glinted. "You have many winters to improve." The cabin became a storage building. Leffingwell moved his instruments, his journals, and his provisions into the wooden structure, but he slept in the snow shelter. The remaining wood, 3.5 cords now, would last longer if he only burned it for cooking and for warming the cabin during working hours. The arrangement was not comfortable. Each morning, he had to brush ice crystals from his beard and eyebrows before his eyelids would open fully. Each evening, he had to warm his hands over the cabin stove before they could hold a pen. But he was alive. And the survey continued. In the gray twilight hours of late December, he began making short trips across the frozen coastline, setting up his theodolite at predetermined points, taking measurements that would form the skeleton of his map. The cold never relented. The thermometer rarely climbed above 40 below, but he was learning to work in it. He traveled with a small emergency kit now, a folding shovel, a snow knife, a canvas tarp. If a storm caught him between shelter points, he could dig a survival hole in under 2 hours. Not comfortable, not even warm, but survivable. The Inupiat called these emergency shelters chinguk, a temporary burrow, not meant for extended use. Leffingwell practiced building them until he could complete one in 90 minutes. 90 minutes to save his own life. It seemed like a reasonable investment. But the real test was still coming. The elders in the village spoke of something they called Aqsaqtuaq, the deep cold, the killing cold, when the temperature dropped so far that even the inside of a properly built shelter could frost over. It came most years in January or February, they said. It lasted 3 days, or 5, or 10. There was no predicting it. When Aqsaqtuaq arrived, even the Inupiat stayed inside. No hunting, no travel, no work of any kind. You lived on stored food and seal oil, and the hope that the cold trap would hold. Leffingwell had survived at 60 below. He had built a shelter that maintained 70 degrees of temperature differential. By any rational calculation, he was prepared. But Aqsaqtuaq had said something that stayed with him. In the worst conditions, there is no shelter that saves you. The temperature in late December held steady at 45 to 50 below. Cold, but manageable. The shelter performed as designed. The survey progressed slowly but steadily. Then January came, and the thermometer began to fall. 52 below on January 2nd, 56 on January 5th, 59 on January 8th. On January 10th, Leffingwell woke in his snow shelter to a sound he had never heard before, a deep, grinding creak that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ice along the coast was shifting, pressure ridges building as the frozen sea contracted. He crawled out of the tunnel and checked his thermometer, 64 degrees below zero. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Each breath was a knife in his lungs. The moisture in his eyes froze, blurring his vision. He could feel the cold reaching through his furs, through his wool, through his skin, searching for his warmth. He retreated to the shelter. Inside, the temperature read 12 below, 52 degrees warmer than outside. The cold trap was holding, but outside, the wind began to rise. And in the village 3 miles east, a child was sick with fever, and the family was running low on seal oil, and the storm that was coming would last longer than anyone expected. The deep cold had arrived. The storm announced itself with sound before sight. A low moan rolled across the tundra from the northwest, rising and falling like something alive. Leffingwell had heard wind before. He had weathered gales on Lake Michigan, had felt the ship's rigging scream during the passage north. But this was different. This sound carried weight. It pressed against the walls of his snow shelter like a physical force. Inside the chamber, the temperature held at 14 below. The cold trap was working. The dense, frigid air pooled in the tunnel's lowest point, forming an invisible barrier that kept the warmer air trapped above. His body heat, accumulated over hours, had raised the chamber temperature nearly 50 degrees above the outside air. But the outside was changing. He crawled through the tunnel to check his thermometer. The wind hit him like a fist. Fine ice crystals drove horizontally, scouring exposed skin, filling his eyes and nose and mouth with frozen particles. He squinted at the mercury column. 67 below zero, and falling. The wind chill, if such calculations had existed in 1906, would have registered somewhere below 90 below. Exposed flesh would freeze in under 2 minutes. A man caught in the open would be dead in 30. Leffingwell retreated to his shelter and sealed the entrance with his pack. The wind's howl faded to a distant murmur, muffled by 4 feet of packed snow. The shelter had become an island, a pocket of survivable air in an ocean of killing cold. He had food enough for 10 days, water he could melt from the shelter's walls. His sleeping furs were rated for temperatures far below what the chamber would reach. He would survive this. But 3 miles east, in the village, the situation was different. Iain, the child's name was Nanook. He was 4 years old, the youngest son of Aqsaqtuaq and his wife Arnaluk. He had developed a fever 3 days earlier, a wet cough that rattled in his small chest, a heat that burned through his skin even as the temperature outside plunged toward 70 below. The family's sod house was sound. The cold trap functioned perfectly. The seal oil lamps burned with steady flames, keeping the interior warm enough that the adults could work in their shirt sleeves. But the oil was running low. The autumn seal hunt had been poor. The ice had formed early, driving the seals north before the hunters could fill their quotas. Most families had enough oil to last the winter if they rationed carefully. Aqsaqtuaq's family had burned through their reserves faster than expected, keeping the lamps high to sweat out the boy's fever. Now, with Aqsaqtuaq howling outside, they faced a choice: let the lamps burn low and conserve oil, or keep them high and run out before the storm passed. If the lamps went out, the cold trap would still work. The chamber would not freeze. But for a sick child with fever, not freezing was not enough. He needed warmth, real warmth, the kind that could break a fever and let a small body heal. Aqsaqtuaq had made a decision. He would travel to the next village, 12 miles east, where his brother kept a larger oil supply. The trip would take 4 hours by dog sled in normal conditions. In this storm, with visibility near zero and the temperature dropping past 70 below, it would take longer. But his son was dying. What choice did he have? Leffingwell did not learn what had happened until the second day of the storm. He had stayed in his shelter, emerging only briefly to check conditions and to retrieve frozen caribou meat from his cabin. The world outside was a white void, snow driven so hard that he could not see his own hand at arm's length. The temperature had stabilized at 69 below, and the wind showed no sign of relenting. Inside the shelter, he worked on his survey calculations by candlelight. The small flame added perhaps 3 degrees to the chamber's temperature, raising it to a relatively comfortable 8 below. His fingers were stiff, his breath still visible, but he could hold a pencil and make notes. The shout came from somewhere in the whiteness. Leffingwell heard it faintly through the packed snow, a voice, high and desperate, cutting through the wind's roar. He grabbed his parka and crawled toward the tunnel. Outside, he saw nothing. The storm had erased the world. But the voice came again, closer now, and he recognized it. Arnaluk, Aqsaqtuaq's wife. She emerged from the white like a ghost, snow caked on her furs, her face raw from windburn. She was dragging something behind her, a sled, small, with a bundle of furs lashed to its surface. The bundle was the size of a child. "He is not breathing right," Arnaluk said. Her English was worse than her husband's, broken and desperate. Aqsaqtuaq went for oil. He has not come back. The lamps are dying. Nanook is dying. Please. There was no time to think. Leffingwell lifted the boy from the sled. He weighed almost nothing, a terrifying lightness that spoke of days without proper food, and carried him down into the tunnel. Arnaluk followed, her movements clumsy with exhaustion. Inside the shelter, the temperature read 6 below. Warmer than outside, but not warm enough. The boy's breathing was shallow, rattling, each exhale a small battle. His skin was hot to the touch, the fever still burning, but his lips had a bluish tinge. He was hypothermic and fevered at the same time. His body was fighting itself. "We need heat," Leffingwell said. "More than this." He lit every candle he had, 4 of them, thick tallow pillars that he had brought for long nights of calculation. He arranged them in a circle around the sleeping platform, close enough that their heat would radiate toward the center. Then he stripped off his outer furs and wrapped them around the boy, layering insulation until only the child's face was visible. The shelter was small. With 2 adults and 4 candles burning, the temperature began to climb. 8 below, 5 below, 2 below, 0, above freezing. The shelter's small volume, which had seemed a limitation, became an advantage. Body heat from 2 adults, flame heat from 4 candles, all trapped by the cold barrier in the tunnel below. The temperature rose faster than Leffingwell had thought possible. 10 above 0, 12, 15. The boy's breathing steadied. Arnaluk told him about Aqsaqtuaq while they waited. Her husband had left the previous morning, just as the storm intensified. He had taken the strongest dogs, the fastest sled, and promised to return by nightfall. Nightfall had come and gone. Then a second dawn, gray and howling. Then a second dusk. He had not returned. "The trail is marked," she said. "Posts every mile. He knows the way. But the snow?" She trailed off, staring at the shelter's curved walls. "The snow covers everything." Leffingwell understood. In a storm, this fierce visibility dropped to feet. The trail markers, wooden posts driven into the ice every mile, would be buried or invisible. A man could pass within arm's reach of a marker and never see it. He could wander in circles until the cold took him. Aqsaqtuaq had been gone for 36 hours, in conditions that would kill an exposed man in 30 minutes. "He found shelter," Leffingwell said. "He must have. The Inupiat know how to build emergency holes. He's somewhere in a snow cave waiting for the storm to pass." Arnaluk looked at him with eyes that held no hope. "Aqsaqtuaq has never built a shelter alone. He was young when his father died. He did not learn." The words landed like a physical blow. There were skills that passed from father to son, elder to youth, generation to generation. Aqsaqtuaq had missed that transmission. He knew how to drive dogs and hunt seals and repair a sod house. But the emergency survival skills, the ones that saved you when everything else failed, those had died with his father before he was old enough to learn. He was somewhere on the tundra in a 70 below blizzard, and he did not know how to save himself. The storm lasted 4 days. On the first night, the boy's fever broke. He woke confused, asking for his father, and Arnaluk fed him small pieces of caribou meat softened in warm water. The shelter's temperature held at 18 above, cold by any civilized standard, but warm enough for a child bundled in furs. On the second day, Leffingwell made a brief trip to his cabin, retrieving more candles, more meat, and the last of his tea. The storm had not relented. If anything, the wind had intensified, but the temperature outside had stabilized at 64 below, still lethal, but no longer dropping. On the third day, Arnaluk stopped speaking. She sat with her son in her arms, staring at the shelter walls, her face empty. Leffingwell recognized the expression. It was the face of someone who had accepted the worst. On the fourth day, the wind died. The silence was the first sign. Leffingwell woke from shallow sleep to absolute quiet. No howling wind, no grinding ice, just the soft sound of breathing, his own, Arnaluk's, the child's. He crawled through the tunnel and emerged into a transformed world. The sky was clear for the first time in days, a pale gray blue that hinted at the sun hidden below the southern horizon. The snow had stopped falling. The temperature read 52 below, cold by any measure, but almost pleasant after the 70 below nightmare of the previous days. And there, half a mile to the east, a figure was moving across the ice. Leffingwell shouted. The figure did not respond, too far away perhaps, or too exhausted to hear. He began running through the knee-deep snow, his legs burning with the effort, his lungs screaming in the cold air. It was not Aqsaqtuaq. It was Aqsaqtuaq. The elder moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick, his face weathered to the color of old leather. Behind him, a dog team waited, and on the sled, was a body. Aqsaqtuaq was not dead. He was close, his hands and feet blackened with frostbite, his face raw and swollen, his breath barely visible, but he was not dead. The dogs had found him, Aqsaqtuaq explained. They had caught his scent 3 miles east of the village, buried in a shallow depression that might have been an attempt at a snow hole. The depression was too shallow, the entrance facing the wrong direction. Cold air had poured in rather than pooling below. He had survived by burning everything he carried, his spare clothing, his food bag, even the leather traces from his sled, in a desperate, failing attempt to generate heat. He lasted 3 days, Aqsaqtuaq said. Another night, he would have died. They brought him to Leffingwell's shelter because it was closest. The sod house in the village was 3 miles further, and Aqsaqtuaq needed warmth now, not in an hour. The snow chamber that Leffingwell had built, the one Aqsaqtuaq had called acceptable, became a hospital. They packed the injured man in furs, surrounded him with heated stones warmed in the cabin stove, and watched as the shelter's trapped air slowly, steadily raised its temperature, 20 above, 25, 30. Aqsaqtuaq's eyes opened on the second day after the storm. He saw his wife, his son, the curved walls of a shelter he did not recognize. "Where am I?" he asked. "In the white man's hole," Arnaluk said. There was something in her voice, relief, gratitude, something else Leffingwell could not name. The one he dug behind his cabin. Aqsaqtuaq stared at the ceiling. His hands were wrapped in cloth. 2 fingers would be lost to the frostbite, possibly 3, but his feet were intact. He would walk again. He would live. "The cold trap," he said finally. "It works." 70 degrees of difference, Leffingwell said. "Body heat only, no fuel. 4 candles raised it to 30 above." The injured man was silent for a long moment. Then he said something in his own language, too quiet for Leffingwell to hear. Arnaluk translated. "He says you have repaid the gift." But Aqsaqtuaq shook his head. "The gift cannot be repaid," the elder said. He was sitting against the shelter wall, his eyes half closed, his weathered face unreadable in the candlelight. "That is what makes it a gift, but what you have done here, this is something different." He opened his eyes and looked at Leffingwell directly. "You took the knowledge we gave you. You built a shelter that my son-in-law could not build, even though he was born here and you arrived 7 months ago. You saved his child when he could not. You saved him when he was dying in a hole that was not deep enough." The elder paused. Outside the temperature was climbing, 45 below now, almost warm by Arctic standards. "I said you would learn faster than most. I was wrong." You learned faster than any white man I have seen in 50 years, and then you did something my own people have forgotten how to do. What is that? You built a shelter alone for yourself because you knew no one would save you if you did not save yourself. Aqsaqtuaq's voice was quiet. My people have always built shelters together. Families, villages, generations. We did not need to learn alone because we were never alone. But the young ones, Aqsaqtuaq's generation, they think shelter is something that already exists. They do not know how to make it from nothing. He stood slowly, his joints creaking. You will teach them, not because you owe us, because you understand something we have started to forget. The news traveled with the dog sleds. Within 2 weeks, hunters from 3 villages had visited Leffingwell's shelter. They studied the entrance tunnel, measured the depth of the cold trap, examined the angle of the roof blocks. Some asked questions. Others simply looked, memorizing the construction with eyes trained by generations of visual learning. Lieutenant Caldwell's cutter did not return until the following summer, when the ice finally broke. By then, Leffingwell had completed the first phase of his survey, 112 miles of coastline mapped, 47 survey points established, measurements accurate enough that satellite verification, decades later, would find errors of less than 250 feet. Caldwell reviewed the reports without comment. He filed them through proper channels. He did not withdraw the funding or reject the maps. He also did not apologize. But in his official summary, submitted to the Revenue Cutter Service Command, he included a single line that had not appeared in any previous Alaska survey report. Field personnel should be advised that indigenous shelter construction methods may prove valuable in extreme conditions. It was not much. It was not enough, but it was, perhaps, a beginning. Leffingwell stayed, not for 1 winter, as he had originally planned, but for 6. He returned to the Arctic coast every year until 1914, completing the most comprehensive survey of Alaska's northern frontier ever attempted by a single individual. He mapped 4,900 square miles of territory, made 31 dog sled expeditions totaling 4,500 miles, and lived among the Inupiat families who had taught him to survive. His USGS Professional Paper 109, published in 1919, became the definitive reference for Arctic Alaska geology. But buried in its technical appendices were detailed descriptions of indigenous survival methods, shelter construction, clothing design, food preservation, cold weather travel, information that had never before appeared in a government scientific publication. He wrote it, he later explained, because the knowledge deserved to be preserved. The Inupiat were teaching it to their children, but the children were leaving for schools in the south, for jobs in the cities, for a world that did not require them to build shelters in 70 below storms. Someone needed to write it down before it was forgotten. The paper was read by military planners preparing for expeditions to Greenland and Antarctica. It was consulted by Arctic researchers for decades. The cold trap entrance design it described appeared in Army survival manuals during the Second World War and remained standard training until the age of heated tents and portable shelters made such knowledge seem obsolete. 2. By then, Leffingwell was long gone from the Arctic. He retired to California in 1923, settling in Whittier, where the winters never dropped below 40 degrees and the only ice was in his drinks. He married late, had no children, and lived quietly in a small house filled with maps and instruments and photographs of a coastline most Americans had never heard of. He received the Charles P. Daly Medal from the American Geographical Society in 1925. He was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 1933. When asked about his years in Alaska, he spoke rarely and briefly, preferring to let his published work speak for itself. He died on January 13, 1971, at the age of 96. The obituaries called him the oldest living polar explorer. None of them mentioned Aqsaqtuaq, or the month he had spent learning to cut snow blocks, or the night a child's fever broke in a shelter warmed by nothing but candles and body heat. But the record remains. On January 10th, 1907, the temperature at Flaxman Island dropped to 67 degrees below zero, with winds exceeding 40 miles per hour. The wind chill reached an estimated 95 below. Exposed flesh would freeze in under 90 seconds. A man without shelter would die in half an hour. That night, a young surveyor from Chicago slept in a hole he had dug behind his cabin. The entrance tunnel descended 4 feet below the floor level. The cold air pooled at the bottom, forming an invisible barrier. The warm air stayed trapped above. Outside, 67 below. Inside, 18 above. Aqsaqtuaq had said it plainly 8 months before. The fire will eat your wood, then the box will become a coffin. The fire did eat the wood, but the coffin never came. Instead, there was a shelter that required no fire, a design that had survived 4,000 years, and a man who was willing to learn it. Ernest de Koven Leffingwell's maps still guide researchers working in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. His measurements still check against modern satellite data with errors measured in feet, not miles. His professional papers are still cited in geological surveys. But his real legacy is simpler than any of that. On the coldest night of his life, in conditions that would have killed him in any Western shelter, he survived, because he trusted the people who had been surviving there for 4,000 years. The snow has long since melted over the spot where he dug. The tundra has reclaimed it, as the tundra reclaims everything, but somewhere beneath the surface, the contours remain, a shallow depression, a tunnel that once descended 18 inches below the floor, a chamber just large enough for a man to lie down, the cold trap, the gift that obligates forever.